My name is Andrew AJ Jarrett. I go by AJ. I have been in IT and cybersecurity for over 15 years now. I currently lead the cyber monitoring and incident response team for DTCC. I've also worked in both public and private sector doing cybersecurity, incident response, assessments, governance, risk and compliance, and basically everything under the sun. I started my career off in IT. I worked my way up from a help desk tech fixing printers to now leading a major team for DTCC. And I'm really excited to talk to y'all today about this topic. So I am a blue teamer at heart, although I've done some work on the pen testing side of the house. I've run pen test teams and assessments before. I am very much a blue teamer. I like cyber defense. That is the place that I am most comfortable and most enjoyable. So excited to talk to y'all today about that. I want to hear from y'all in terms of questions and things of that nature. So I've also included my LinkedIn information. Feel free to add me there. Would love to chat and stay in touch with folks if you have any questions, comments, things of that nature. That said, this is one of 3 talks I'm going to be giving this summer, so they kind of are designed to add on to each other. Today, we're going to talk about the fundamentals of how to build a cyber defense program. So building those fundamental elements to be able to go out and do the stuff. In my next talk, we're going to talk about what a SOC does, how that works, and kind of deep dive the defensive tactics. This is more the programmatic elements of how do you get everything in place to be able to do the fun stuff. We're going to have some fun on this, though. I'm going to ask you questions. I know that you cannot necessarily answer because everyone is on mute, but I'm going to ask you to think about things. And then if you have any questions at the end, we've reserved some time for Q&A, and it's going to be really important. We want to hear from you. I want to answer your questions as good as possible. Do be cognizant, we do have a couple more sessions after this. So, later in the summer, we're going to talk about other components of blue teaming together. So keep your eyes peeled for those. So our key takeaways today, we're going to talk about how do we build a cyber defense program? What are the key components of it? Understanding programmatic pillars, people, process, and technology. That's executive speak for how do you what are the elements of a program. We're going to talk about what do we mean when we say security controls and different types of controls. We're going to determine when to use certain security controls. And then we're going to talk about governance, risk, and compliance, which I know is the most exciting thing in the world. And we're going to spend a ton of time on that. I'm kidding. We have like one slide. But we are going to talk about it and how having governance, risk, and compliance baked into your security program from the get-go is an advantage. And then finally, we're going to talk a lot about how to get executive buy-in and support for the program. This is really, really important in order to be successful. It's one thing to say, hey, we want to do, cool cybersecurity stuff. We're going to stand up a SOC and they're going to fight the bad guys and everything else. If you don't have budget, if you don't have that executive buy-in, then it's not going to happen. So we're going to spend a lot of time on that. A lot of time on what senior leadership is looking for in terms of programs in order for your program to be successful. I'll also share some resources at the end that I've used in the past to help align programs and things like that. And then, like I said, I'm expecting some good questions from y'all. We've got a good number of attendees today, so I'm betting we're going to have some great questions. So with that, let's dive in. So what is the mission of a cybersecurity program? It's important to start with the mission. Why do we want to start with the mission? Well, if we don't have our mission defined, if we don't know what we're building our cyber defense program for, then it's kind of difficult to be successful, right? How do you measure success if you don't set a goal? I like to say that the mission of any cyber defense program is to ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, or CIA, of computer systems and company data. So your organization, the cyber defense program is supposed to, defend the CIA of data. Now, for those of you who have some cybersecurity certifications, you've probably heard that term before. For those who haven't, this is a fundamental concept of cybersecurity. So confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality meaning, is secret information still secret? Integrity, has the information been modified or changed by unauthorized folks? And availability, is it available for the organization to use? So when we talk about company networks and things like that, if the network's down, if the core applications and processes aren't working, company can't do business. If the information flowing across the network can't be trusted, if the information in the application can't be trusted because it's been modified, company can't do business. In a lot of cases, data disclosure is painful and expensive. So, confidentiality is also very important. We want to strike a balance between C, I, and A. So one element is not necessarily more important than the other. It's up to the company to decide which elements are most important in each context. But for example, a perfectly secure system is probably not available, right? A perfectly secure system that no threat actor could ever, if we wanted it to be confidential, perfectly confidential, no threat actor could ever access it, get that data. Great, that's a turned off computer, encased in concrete, dumped into the bottom of the ocean at the bottom of the Marianas Trench. Not really available though. So we're going to talk a lot about security controls and kind of how a security program needs to strike a balance between the elements of the CIA triad, as well as the needs of the business, and understanding how we can do as good as we can without destroying or taking down the business. So the fundamentals of a cyber defense program, there's a lot of ways to go about it. I've seen different companies, different organizations, government agencies do things differently. Where you're going to put your security organization is important. What different teams and how you're going to divide the organization up is very important. But at the end of the day, there's core functions that you must have. So we want to monitor the environment for signs of breaches and intrusions. That's your SOC function, Security Operations Center. You want to proactively discover security vulnerabilities and exposures. That's vulnerability management. That's your offensive security, pen testing, red teaming, things like that. You want to remediate intrusions, breaches, exposures, vulnerabilities rapidly. So that's incident response, that's exposure management, et cetera, et cetera. And then you want to ensure compliance with regulatory requirements and industry best practices wherever possible, or aligned to frameworks. Most organizations have some sort of regulatory compliance, even if it's or legal requirement to do some level of cybersecurity, even if it's just making best efforts to protect their network. Or if you're like in the financial services sector, like I am, you have regulators actively looking at your program several times a year to make sure that you're doing all the things you're supposed to be doing. All right, so where should we start? How do we get started? Let's say blank slate, you have come into an organization and they say, we want a cyber program, we don't currently have one. Good luck finding an organization like that, but let's, for evaluation's sake, or for the sake of this argument, let's pretend that we have a notional organization that has no security program, and we have been given the opportunity to build a cyber defense program from scratch. What do we need? Well, before we start figuring out, what kind of tools are we going to buy, who are we going to hire, what's that team going to look like, and everything else, we really need to sit down and talk about some fundamental stuff. It's not super exciting. It really isn't. But we have to understand our organization's priorities, our risk tolerance, and our key business processes above all else. So what does our organization do? What kind of company is it? What is the risk tolerance? So everything has a risk. Every business activity carries with it some level of risk. You're going to have to get buy-in from the senior leadership of the organization to say, okay, what are we risk tolerant on? What are we not risk tolerant on? Where do we want to invest the resources that we're going to put into a cyber defense program to do, the most good possible, and to address the risks that the organization cares about? And then finally, the key business processes. What are the crown jewels? What must be defended at all costs? What business process cannot go down? What keeps the company in business? And what is the most important? What are the most important assets on the network? Things like that. Understanding that allows us to then architect a program around the risks of the business. We want to make risk-based decisions, meaning that we want to evaluate risks, we want to address those risks, and we want to then periodically reevaluate to make sure that we are still in line with, the goals of the company and the risks in the environment. Next up, once we've gotten a lay of the land of the company and we have an understanding of what needs to be defended from a cybersecurity perspective, we need to identify legal and regulatory requirements, and we need to pick some sort of framework to hang all of this on. So what do I mean by that? Well, again, I come from the finance world right now. I've worked in other regulated industries as well, and there are a lot of regulators. It is important to understand what regulations your organization may have to comply with. If you're doing business with the federal government or you are the federal government, there's regulations around NIST 853. There's also regulations around CMMC if you work in defense, things like that. I'm not going to give you a full listing of all the regulatory requirements out there. You need to understand the regulatory requirements that affect your organization, and they are going to have some requirements around cybersecurity. Most of these requirements, no matter where you are, even globally, are fairly consistent because best practices are best practices. But you need to know what those regulatory requirements are so that you can make sure that you're hitting all the things that you absolutely must be hitting to avoid, regulatory and legal troubles. Also, you have to look at, legal requirements. So if your organization has entered into contracts with other companies and has promised to, make certain efforts around security or to meet certain requirements around security, that's important as well. It's a great idea to then wrap this in a framework to say, okay, there's some sort of framework we're going to use to guide our principles. I really like NIST cybersecurity framework or the CRI profile. These are really good vendor agnostic frameworks that say, okay, the security program should have controls that do, blank. And it allows you to then align your security program with best practices. These best practices are updated, and again, they're vendor agnostic. NIST is a U.S. government agency, and CRI is like an independent trade group. But you want to pick what model you're going to align your processes to. NIST CSF is a great one. There are others out there. You need to find the one that meets your regulatory requirements, meets your business requirements, and what have you. But it's important not to, freelance and come up with a program out of scratch, out of nothing. There's plenty of material out there. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. We need to define our operating model next. So we have a framework, we understand our requirements, we understand what the crown jewels that we're defending are, we understand what the company's risk appetite is. Now we have to build an operating model to identify where those cyber defense functions are going to live within our organization, how are they going to interact with the other portions of the organization, and then determine how we, determine what those reporting lines look like and things like that. Then finally, we want to figure out how we measure success of the program. So, management tells us build a cyber defense program. Great, we've done this assessment, we figured out our goal, we have a mission. Now we need to come up with how do we tell management that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. So just a little double click on operating model. An operating model defines your key roles and responsibilities, often in the form of a RACI chart. So responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. You'll break up all the functions of your cyber defense program, and then you'll have, the various teams that are one of the RACIs across the top, and then you'll define, this team is responsible, this team is accountable, this team is consulted, this team is informed. You want to lay out the organization of the security program, the reporting lines, who's responsible for what, especially when you get into senior management. Authorities of key individuals like your CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, the head of your SOC or your incident response team should, have some defined responsibilities in the event of a cyber incident, etc. You want to put that into your operating model. And then governance, oversight, and audit considerations. How are you going to provide that governance, risk, and compliance piece? Who provides oversight of the operational teams? And then, what does the auditing environment look like? What does your internal audit in your company look like? Or do you bring in external auditors? It just depends on, where you're at on that continuum. Operating models may be super simple. You may have a CISO Their direct reports are responsible for each of the key functions of the cybersecurity program. They're all together in one part of the organization. Or it may be more complicated. In larger organizations, there's often pieces of responsibility in other parts of the company. So think about, IT department, risk department, legal department, HR department, et cetera, may own certain pieces of security, and the operating model has to knit all that together. Also, another thing to note is that some of the functions of your security program may be outsourced. There are managed service providers and managed security service providers out there that offer different services, and you may bring them in. That also needs to be part of your operating model. Those considerations should be defined. So when we talk about program pillars, if we're talking in executive speak, we typically talk about people, process, and technology, kind of the three main pillars. I put process first, even though I say people, process, and technology. I put process first because it's often easier to build your processes initially than hire your people and implement your technology. So your processes give you a framework. Your people are the ones who have to carry it out, and then your technology is what enables everything and stitches it all together. So when we talk about these program pillars, if we talk about processes, we want to define our overall security strategy. Remember, we went back to the mission. We had to define, what the risk tolerance of the organization was as well, and what our crown jewels are, and build that operating model. That's the basis by which we're going to build out a security program. Then we're going to have specific processes, policies, and processes for specific portions of the program. You also want to develop mechanisms for continuously testing, validating, and improving your processes. So it's one thing to say, hey, we wrote an incident response plan. Okay, great. When was the last time you tested it? And I don't mean, hey, we ran a tabletop and we said we invoked the incident response plan and we fought the bad guys and we won. That's not what we're looking for. Actual testing of the processes. It can be done in pieces. It can be done all together. It depends on how complicated they are, but you need to have some validation because things change. Best practices change. The NIST cybersecurity framework gets updated from time to time. CRI profile gets updated from time to time. NIST 853 gets updated from time to time. You don't want to wait for those major changes to be updating your program. You should be continuously evaluating and have some sort of feedback mechanism to say, hey, we're making our processes better. We're writing better policies. Our procedures are getting more granular, more detailed, more specific. And then, that all goes into validation through realistic scenarios. And then also I typically recommend having third-party validation. It's one thing to have your audit department. If you're a bigger company with an internal audit division, great. I wouldn't say that they're the best third-party auditors. You want to bring in experts, and you want to rotate who those experts are, so that you don't get bias. If the same person comes and evaluates your program over and over and over again every quarter, after a couple years, there's not going to be much else that person is going to be able to do for you, and they're going to become biased by having been with you. So you need to bring in external validation whenever possible. I like to rotate in different companies to help us evaluate our cyber incident response plan and review it every year. We use a different vendor. Have a different vendor come in and run tabletop exercises for us and evaluate the team in that sense. Run functional exercises for it and evaluate the team in that sense. That external validation is very, very important, and we'll talk about that later. People, I can't say enough about hiring talented individuals. This could be a whole master class. This could be a semester-long session on the art of hiring. You really want to have people who match well with your strategy. You want to have processes in place to be able to encourage, incentivize growth behaviors. So people who go out and learn more and take on additional responsibilities, you need to be able to, provide them a pathway and say, hey, we're going to promote you. We're going to give you new challenges, etc. And then you absolutely must organize teams under excellent managers, not good managers, excellent managers. Bad management is probably the single biggest factor that holds back security programs. It's not tools, it's not processes, it's typically bad leadership. So especially in the senior leadership, but even, in the middle management and your team leads, that leadership has to be excellent, because what you're doing for the organization is absolutely critical. So this is not where you want your B players to be. You absolutely want your managers to be as fantastic as possible. And then technology. So we want to build a set of controls or a security stack based on our strategies that we've written. We want to implement mechanisms to regularly evaluate those security controls. Things are ever changing. We find new vulnerabilities every day. What was best practice 5 years ago is no longer best practice in certain areas. Somebody needs to be checking that on a continuous basis. And then you need to be prepared to change your security stack over time. So if you buy a series of products, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, you need to be ready to say, okay, hey, we may run this product for the next few years, but then eventually we're going to reevaluate and see if this product is doing what it needs to be doing for us. If it's not, it's time to switch. So jumping into security controls, we have 4 categories of controls. It's kind of complicated. So it's 4 categories of controls, but they're not individual. There's really 2 categories of controls: detective and preventative controls. And then within that, there's 2 categories of controls: policy controls and technical controls. So your detective controls are things that allow your SOC to see activity, catch malicious activity, and then do something about it afterwards. Detective controls don't prevent things. Preventative controls prevent users or threat actors from taking actions, doing bad things on our network. Policy controls can be detective or preventative. These are policy documents or policy procedures that change employee behavior or regulate employee behavior and create business processes in order to feed into our controls. So a policy control that is a preventative control might be an acceptable use policy for your employees to say that, employees are not allowed to bring company devices to North Korea. That's a policy control. That is preventative. Technical controls can also be detective or preventative. And these are your software, your systems, things like that your security team can leverage. So, think about your firewalls, think about your intrusion detection system, think about antivirus and EDR. Your SIM is a detective control, or really the content on your SIM are each detective controls. So when we speak corporate speak, we talk in terms of controls. When we speak to regulators and audit, we talk in terms of controls. What we mean by that are these. So it's important to understand how we can layer those on. And when we get into the technical controls, we're going to build out a security stack. This is not a complete list of things that do, but broadly, your technical controls are going to do the following. They're going to broker or control access. They're going to block or prevent malicious traffic or malicious files. They're going to detect malicious activity. They're going to find vulnerabilities and misconfigurations in the environment, your exposures. And you're going to apply these technical controls to your endpoints. So think servers, workstations, mobile devices, etc. Your network, so specific segments within the network. Think about where you have firewalls, where you have intrusion detection systems, things like that. Apply this to your cloud as well, endpoints within the cloud, as well as cloud network and things of that nature. So your workloads, your resources, your network connections, as well as your cloud control plane. And then identity. So think user accounts, service accounts, Active Directory, privileged access management. You're going to have a lot of detective and preventative controls on top of that. So this is a list of kind of a suggested security stack. It is by no means an exhaustive list, and like I said, we're gonna deep dive this a little bit more in a future session later this summer. But some of the controls we might have: SIM, NDR, EDR, identity threat detection and response. This is newer, but this is a good thing to have. Your traditional firewalls, network firewalls, as well as application firewalls. Very, very important. DDoS protection, having that in front of your production environment so you don't get DOSed. Data loss protection to keep files from being moved out of the company or shared inappropriately. Tools to allow for penetration testing and vulnerability and posture management, so scanning your network to find vulnerabilities, attempting common penetration testing tactics to make sure that your environment is hardened. Mobile device management, that's a big area. Again, could be its own masterclass. There's others, if your company makes use of VPN, CASB, Cloud Access Security Broker, Zero Trust Network Access, Privileged Access Management. These are all technical controls that might be part of your security stack. In a large company, pieces of these security stacks are going to be typically run by dedicated engineering teams. You're going to have dedicated architecture teams that are looking at this. All of this needs to feed into your overall security strategy. If you don't sit down and build that security strategy first, and you start layering tools on here, you're going to start finding that they don't work well together because you didn't plan it out. So it's very important to talk about. But like I said, we're going to talk about this more in my next webinar next month. So determining when to use each control. Security should strike a balance. Again, think about that CIA triad. We don't want it to be so secure that it's not available. At the same time, we don't want it to be out and open and hanging out on the internet, ready to be taken. Security decisions need to be risk-based, and so we need to consider both the risk of potential control is addressing. We need to block this type of access, as well as any risks that implementing the control might be. Hey, we're going to block access to this service. Okay, great, but we have some business processes that rely on that. Okay, is the business process more important than the security risk? Is there a way to do both? Block it most of the time, enable it for the business process. We have to think about that as we're applying controls. It's not enough to just say block it. You can't be the no department. The security department has to enable the business. Typically, detective controls are going to have a lower impact. It's not going to prevent the user from taking action. It's just going to fire an alert in the SOC when it occurs. But the risk of damage in that situation is higher because you're delaying potentially stopping malicious activity. So, in some places it makes sense to put detective controls in place because you can't put preventative controls in place. But it's a trade-off. You're accepting a higher level of risk if all you have is detective controls and you don't have preventative controls. And multiple controls should be combined to provide defense in depth. A single control should not be the thing standing between you and a massive ransomware attack. It should be a series of controls, because you should assume that a single control will fail at some point. Either you didn't think of every use case, and so it's not architected perfectly because it's impossible to be, or something happens, the service goes down, the system doesn't work the way it's supposed to work, a new attack vector that no one's ever heard of comes out, whatever. So you should have a series of controls. And that's where going back to those key business processes is really important when we talk about controls. We need to understand what is the most important thing to the business. Where's our most important data? What's our most important business processes that rely on technology? Great, now how do we build controls on top of that to enable those business processes while making them as secure as possible? And then again, remember, we have to regularly evaluate these controls. That's where your red teaming comes in. That's where your penetration testing, application security, things like that, to make sure that these controls are effective. That's absolutely critical, because it's one thing to say we have these controls in place. It's another thing to say we know they work. So a lot of talk on that. Like I said, we're going to talk a lot more on this in my next webinar, where we're going to talk a little bit more technical. This is, again, trying to stay very high level and talk about striking the balance and how do we build the framework by which we get to do all the cool stuff. All right, so governance, risk, and compliance. I can hear the groans from some of you through my headset right now. I can't actually hear them, but I can imagine them. As a very technical security guy who came up from IT, doing help desk and then networking and virtualization platform and stuff like that, and then transitioning into security, the governance, risk, and compliance does not make me excited, but it is absolutely necessary. It's a critical component to the success of our program. As much as I would love to solve technical problems all day, every day, if we don't have governance, risk, and compliance in place, if we don't have a GRC process, our program is going to fail. So GRC allows us to ensure that our security program is aligning with those organizational goals. We said, hey, we wanted to build, we wanted to map out our mission. We wanted to find out the organizational goals and that risk tolerance and everything else. The organizational goals and the risk tolerance and things like that changes over time. So you have to have a team that is looking at that and is staying in tune with what's going on in the organization and saying, hey, the organization's risk tolerance is changing. How does our current control environment, how does our current program match up to that risk tolerance, those organizational goals, et cetera, et cetera? It's as well as changing regulatory requirements. So we live in a world now where new regulatory requirements around cybersecurity are dropping, several times a year, depending on what industry you're in. And new ones are coming out of the woodwork. Somebody has to track that, because you don't want to get into a situation where you're way down the road with your security program. You haven't paid attention to any regulatory requirements. You haven't paid attention to what the business needs. And then suddenly there's a huge mismatch. You need to do some sort of key initiative, and it just completely doesn't match with the business. That's a career limiting move when you get into management. So it's super important that we have a GRC program that keeps us aligned. We want to track risks, and we want to track all those risk-based decisions we made. We talked about security controls. We talked about when to use those controls. That shouldn't be a from the hip decision when we make a decision to apply a security control. And it shouldn't be a decision that doesn't get written down. Somebody should track the fact that, hey, this is the decision that was made. This is why. These are the risk factors that were taken into consideration. And then that should be periodically reviewed to say, did we make the right decision? It's okay to go back later and say, okay, well, we made a risk-based decision a year ago on this control, but upon further reflection, or because the risk environment has changed, we want to make a change. Somebody has to track that. It's not going to be your SOC team. So you got to have a GRC team, at least, even in a smaller organization, at least a dedicated individual who is tracking this kind of stuff. This allows our technical teams to focus on the technical parts. It allows our SOC analysts to do SOC analyst things. It allows our pen testers to do pen tester things. And they have to produce some artifacts that go to the GRC team, and it can be annoying, but it's super important. This is also how we prove that we're matching that framework that we decided. The other big thing, and we're going to dive into next, is this is how we can track our key metrics and provide reporting to our senior management. So those people who gave us the mandate to build the security program and then gave us all the money to build the security program, they're going to want to know as you go that your security program is adequate. Part of that's going to be, audits and external validation and things like that. But part of it's going to be day-to-day operational stuff that your GRC team is going to look at. So it's really, really important to have this team built out from the beginning. You don't want to bolt it on at the end, and you want to keep them as close together with the people doing the work as possible, so that there's an understanding. If they're way separate and your governance, risk, and compliance people don't understand cybersecurity, that's going to be a problem. At the same time, if your operations teams, if your hands-on keyboard folks don't understand the importance of governance, risk, and compliance and how it feeds into enabling the mission, that's also a problem. If I tell my SOC team all the time, okay, you guys want cool tools? You want to have the latest and greatest? Great. We have to show leadership that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, and we have to show leadership why there's a need for the cool tools. Why do we need the big curve monitors? Why do we need the super powerful laptops? Et cetera, et cetera. That is where, like I said, governance, risk, and compliance, if you bake it in from the beginning, can be very important. So that's the end of my soapbox on that. And I say that as a technical guy. Let's spend the rest of the talk now on executive support and how we tie all this together. Like I said before, executive buy-in is absolutely critical. Your security program will not be successful without executive support. If there's a mismatch between the business and the security team objectives, that's what happens when there's poor executive buy-in. If you're not talking with the rest of the business, if you're not understanding the rest of the business. So executive buy-in means the executives provide you with guidance, with direction, with their opinions and information about what's going on elsewhere in the company. Poor execution or poor executive buy-in can also lead to inadequate security controls. So, that's where your budget gets denied. Hey, we need this really important control. We need to filter our email. Great. If executives, if you're not talking to your senior leadership team about that ahead of time to say, hey, we're gonna have to spend a lot of money on this tool, but here's why it's important. It's 80% of our attack surface. If you can't make that case, if you're not providing that information to your executive team, you don't get the budget. It can also lead to high burnout and turn over the security team. If the security team's job is stacked against them because they don't have the best tools, because they don't have the support of the organization, if they say, hey, we need to do this to secure the organization, and the organization always says no, because there's not good executive buy-in and there's no support there, security people are going to leave. We want to do a good job. We want to do cool stuff. We want to solve interesting problems. If security people don't get the opportunity to do that, they will absolutely leave. And poor executive buy-in and mismatch between the business and the security department will absolutely cause that burnout and turnover. If your managers on your security team don't understand the business and they're going, oh my God, they're gonna disband our team, and they're telling that to their direct reports, because things are so disconnected. That's going to have a massive impact on morale. And then if you're not meeting your legal and regulatory requirements, that's going to cause legal and regulatory action. Regulators will come in and they will absolutely hit you. They will say, show us what you're doing for your security program. Okay, great, now prove it. And if there's a big mismatch, that can be a big problem. And again, when you get into the management level, it becomes a career limiting move. So you're thinking like a senior leadership person, thinking like a senior executive. What do they want to know? They want to know, what are our top risks? Are we meeting all of our legal, regulatory, and business requirements? How are we addressing our risks? And how do we validate that our program is functioning correctly? Those are the big questions. They don't necessarily care about the detail of, oh, MTTR in our SOC went down 5% because of this, really interesting workflow where this one type of ticket gets processed a little bit differently. No, they want to know high level. Are we doing what we're supposed to be doing? Do we know what our top risks are, and are we addressing them? So thinking back to our fundamentals, how do we get that support? We need to develop reporting and messaging. So we need to restate our security program's mission and goals. We need to talk about how the program is meeting those goals and objectives. We need to talk about what those top risks are. We need to talk about what the program is doing to address those top risks. And then we need forums for senior leadership to ask questions and provide feedback. So it needs to be a two-way street. It's not just here's a report detailing everything we've done. Thanks, talk to you next month. There needs to be back and forth. There needs to be opportunity for the leads within your security program to hear back from senior management about what they're reporting. You don't just chuck the metrics over the wall and say, okay, we're done. Like it has to be a two-way street to keep that alignment. Finally, how do we validate? We're going to talk KPIs, KRs very quickly, and then we're gonna get to the end here in just a moment. KPIs are key performance indicators. KRIs, key risk indicators. We also want to do exercise drills, simulations to say, hey, okay, in the event of a very bad day, if you don't have one very often, we want to simulate one so that we can run the team through its paces and show that all the processes work. And then we want to bring in that third-party review and validation. So like I talked about before, that could be audits, that could be outside facilitated exercises, that could be having an outsider, review your plans, policies, and procedures, bringing in outsiders to meet with the team, interview the team, provide you an assessment. All of that is very, very important, and you should rotate those vendors on a regular basis, rotate those outsiders, so you're constantly getting outside engagement and it's not becoming stale, so that your program stays current. And you want to share all that with your executive leadership team as it's going, to say, hey, we've identified gaps, here's what we're doing about them. Hey, we've also identified that we're following best practices in all these areas, and that we're doing everything that we can be doing to address these top risks. Real quick, KRIs and KPIs, some examples. There are lots of them out there. I'm not going to give you a whole list, but some examples. These are metrics that can be reported on a monthly basis to show how well is the security program doing, and what are the risks to the organization. And then if you're using an outside vendor that does any of the functions for you, you need to ensure that they are reporting, not only reporting KPIs and KRIs to you regularly, but that you are also validating that their methodology and how they calculate those metrics are correct. I'm not saying that they're going to cook the books, but I am saying that they have a vested interest in making sure that they look as good as possible to your leadership team. So have a validation process in place. Bringing it all together, ensuring our program is aligned with the rest of the business, that is our number one goal. We want to restate the mission and objectives of our program regularly when we're talking to senior leadership. We need them to understand this is our goal, this is why we're doing it. And everything we're telling you about relates to that goal. You want to answer those big questions we just talked about. What are the key risks? What do we need to worry about? What are we doing about it? We want to report our key metrics, but we want to keep it brief. Pages and pages of metrics are not going to get read. You want to pick a handful of impactful ones to say, this is how we know we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. Here you go. And then you want to move on. You want to provide opportunities for feedback, advice, and buy-in. Again, that two-way street. You need to hear from senior leadership about what senior leadership wants from the security team. And then you should include your executives in your exercises and your drills and simulations so they can see how the sausage is made. They can see the plans and processes in action. This is one of the most important things that you can do. It's one thing to say, hey, we have all of our plans, policies, and procedures. Look at all these metrics that we're reporting, yada, yada. It's another thing to put the team on the hot seat and drop the senior leaders into it as well and say, watch us do what we do best. This is what you pay for. Obviously that is a double-edged sword. So you gotta be a little careful. If you're not, as good as possible, then if you have major issues, that could be a problem. But at the same time, it builds that trust. It gets them to understand that these are what these metrics mean. This reporting that I get every month, this is the team behind it, and this is what they're doing. So, to review what we've talked about today, when we're building a cyber program, we have to start with the fundamentals. We got to understand our mission. We have to understand the needs of the business and the risk tolerance of the business. We need to carefully plan out our people, process, and technology. I recommend starting with the process because that will help guide you in the people and the technology pieces. As we're building out our controls and our security stack to achieve the goals that we're trying to achieve, we need to use defense in depth. We need to understand the risks and benefits of using different controls, and we need to layer as many of them on top of each other as makes sense based on the risk tolerance of the organization. We need to understand the overall strategy of the program as it relates to selecting our security stack. We don't want to buy tools without a plan. We want to build out that governance, risk, and compliance component early. We want to bolt it into our security program from the get-go, and we want to use it as much as possible to tell our story and provide continuous monitoring and continuous improvement to say, hey, yep, we're validating that we're doing everything that we should be doing. We're validating the needs that we have. This is why we're asking for new stuff from senior leadership, etc. And then we want to ensure that we have effective reporting for senior executives and have our business. Couple references. There are many frameworks out there. These are a few that I really recommend. These will be in the deck if you get a copy of it. Don't reinvent the wheel. Use frameworks that already exist and align your program to it. That's part of the validation, to say we're following best practices. Don't take our word for it. Here's the framework we're using. Okay, that is a great question. How do you start a SOC with the resources you already have in the organization? There's a few ways to do this, and it depends on what resources you have. If you have a CISO, great. Now you have a place to centralize the security function. But if you're going to do it without hiring additional resources, you're going to need to figure out who can be in the SOC. Typically, we're going to look for some technical folks to do the monitoring and things like that. So if you have teams that are already doing something similar to security monitoring, that is a great place to start. I do recommend ultimately breaking the SOC out. You don't want the SOC to be like part of the regular IT team. You do need some level of separation there ultimately, but that's a great place to start. So looking at some of the technical teams. A big thing that we do where I'm at is, although we have a team that is doing cyber monitoring and we have people who are experts in incident response, we also deputize others, especially in our IT organization, in the event of a cyber incident. We say, hey, you're part of the response team now. So instead of having this completely separate response team of people waiting for an incident to occur, you can turn around and designate people in other teams to say you are part of the response team in the event of a cyber incident. And again, that's where having all of that in place is really good. From a monitoring standpoint, you already have the logs that you need in most places in your IT stack. You want to consume the logs from your network appliances. You want to consume the logs from your endpoints and things like that. You want to add some additional technologies if you don't have them. EDR, NDR, stuff like that. But a lot of cases, you have most of the logs you need to bring into the SIEM to do some level of monitoring today. It's just having a SIEM to bring it to, or having a place to bring it all together. What is the roadmap for cyber forensics in 2025? I think there are a couple of major ways that, and I didn't really talk about it today. We're going to talk about it in a future webinar a little bit more. There's a couple different ways organizations attack forensics. If you have a lot of resources, you can build a forensics program in-house. I'm going to tell you that it is rather expensive. And if you build a forensics program in-house, you have to provide care and feeding for that forensics program moving forward, or you don't really have a forensics program. Like if you send people to some training for forensics and you buy a bunch of equipment for forensics, and then for 2 years you never do forensics, you never practice, you don't have a forensics program in 2 years. You have a pile of stuff. It's not the same. So what most organizations, especially the smaller and medium-sized ones do, and even the larger ones to some degree, is they outsource that function to specialists, companies that do nothing but forensics all day, every day, and they make use of those. That's not to say that you don't have some forensics capabilities in-house. You should have some. You should have some people who can pull artifacts and can conduct deeper investigations. But if they don't have the practice, if you don't have the resources to keep them current, then you're really fighting an uphill battle. So roadmap-wise, forensics is still important, but it takes a long time. It takes a lot of resources, and so if you don't have the resources to build out a full forensics team, which most organizations don't, you need to have one on retainer. All right. In general, I am not a fan of purchasing tools without doing a proof of concept. So testing the tool out to make sure it meets the requirements. I am a suspicious person by nature, and so no offense to my friends in sales, but I am not going to take their promises at face value. I'm going to say, that's great that you say your tool can do that. Let's go hands-on and make sure that it does. That said, there are situations where if you have a tool, it's well known already. You have some independent validation that it does all the things that it's supposed to do. Maybe you've implemented it somewhere else, or a lead on your team has, and they say, yeah, it would meet all of our requirements, and it's solving a problem that needs to be solved right now, and we don't have months to run through a POC. And it's not maybe a huge investment. I would say that it might be okay. You should still evaluate that. You should still come up with criteria, and you should still look at it. But it's probably okay to implement it without the POC first. Again, if you can justify it with, hey, we need it right now. We know it's probably good enough. We'll reevaluate it at a set point in the future. And if it doesn't, if it stops meeting our criteria, then we will switch off of it. That said, most tools should go through a POC process, and you should involve lots of people in that POC process. The people who have to use the tool, the people who have to implement and maintain the tool, etc., should be all part of the POC process. All right, how can AI be leveraged for GRC? We are seeing a lot of uses of AI in security. I mean, we have for a long, long time seen machine learning and things like that. The precursors to like generative AI and agentic AI. But from a GRC standpoint, there's a lot of process technology, stats, documentation that is often scattered throughout the security program, throughout the technology program, and everything else. And I think the best use of AI I've seen from a GRC perspective is being able to consume all of that information and bubble up insights. So being able to say, hey, I've got a tool that can go out and can grab all the stats in our environment to make sure that everything is meeting the security baselines that we've set. Or I've got a tool that can read all of our documentation, our processes, and everything else to ensure that we're actually following them. When it comes to implementation, or when it comes to security monitoring, or incident response, or pen testing, or whatever. Those are the biggest things that I have seen. I have not seen, just huge leaps and bounds as a result of AI. It's more helping humans do tedious work faster. Is the biggest thing that I've seen AI do in security and GRC in general. Oh, and we will talk about AI in I think my third webinar is we are going to specifically talk about AI for security, so stay tuned. All right, how do you choose a model? And I'm assuming you mean like the frameworks that we were talking about. Or if you mean an operating model, how do you choose an operating model? Let me answer both questions because I think we got just a second to do that. How do you choose a framework? You need to look at what are the requirements of your company or your organization, what regulatory legal requirements do you need to meet, and what framework best aligns with those requirements and the company's requirements. And again, there's a handful of them out there. Pick the best one for you. When it comes to an operating model, this is a question that I have never seen a clean answer to. The answer is it depends, and it depends entirely on your organization, what your needs are, what resources currently are available, and then how much is the organization willing to spend. Most organizations outsource pieces of their security program. And this is because a company that does nothing but that all day, every day, can typically, at least at the beginning, when the maturity of your program is low, typically an outsourced company can do the process better. As your maturity grows, you may outgrow some of those, some of those outsourced things. Where the security organization lives in your organization depends on the risk tolerance of the organization. If cybersecurity is one of the most important things to your organization, it might live in the risk organization. It is a risk that needs to be managed, and it's one of the most important, so it's going to be dedicated to that. Or it could be in IT because it's a technology thing, and technology is where it needs to go. It's related to technology, and that's fine. That's typically where a lot of organizations start when they're lower on the maturity line, is they have IT, cybersecurity, and then they move more mature and move it out. There also could be the security division may be completely separate. I've seen more and more of that, where the security division, the CISO, is a direct report to the CEO, is a peer to other chief executives, etc. The one thing I will say is do not put security in finance. It is not a cost center to be managed. It's a risk. It's a risk to be managed, and it's a very difficult and time-consuming and a detailed risk that takes a lot of work to understand. And sticking in finance to treat it like a cost center is where security goes to die. Don't do that. But operating model wise, you got to find what works for you and what resources are available. The biggest thing is define one. Make sure that there is some sort of operating model that says this is how we do security. Here's who's responsible for what, so that when something big happens, that's already clear. That's already hashed out. There's no I'm doing this. My team's going to take over. We're going to run incident response. Now the incident response team is going to do incident response. That's been the thing from the get-go. Here's how you fit into that. If you define that ahead of time, it's much, much easier than trying to cobble it together when something bad happens. Absolutely. Thank you all for being a part of this today. Thank you for your wonderful questions. Like I teased before, we're going to do a couple more of these webinars this summer where we're going to dive into this further. So today was kind of a high level, here's how to build the program, and then we're going to get into more of the technical and the how to defend against attacks in the future, which is going to be really exciting. I hope you join us for those. And the big thing is keep fighting the good fight. Build the best security program that you possibly can with the resources that you have, and keep working to fight the bad guys. This is absolutely worthwhile in terms of a career, in terms of why we do what we do, and I'm so excited to see so many people who take this seriously as well who are here today. So looking forward to seeing y'all in future webinars.